He occasionally tried to climb the wire, so we did in fact build like an overhang to just ensure he wouldn't get out.
The situation would only get worse as Christian grew bigger. George Adamson, the legendary wildlife conservationist, had offered Christian a place at his reserve in Kenya. But Ace and John were starting to worry that the Kenyans were going to refuse to let Christian into their country.
We did get scared that it could all fall through, so we got quite worried.
Ace and John's dream of returning Christian to the wild was in serious doubt, and with no fallback plan, Christian's entire future hung in the balance. After 3 months of negotiations, the Kenyan government finally gave their permission for Christian to enter the country. The young lion was on his way to Africa.
We get him out to Heathrow. We gave him a very mild sedative, which was recommended by various vets and the London Zoo.
I remember we stood there and we saw him, and then they put something in the front so that he couldn't see anymore. And then he was lifted on the hoist up into the hold, and it was quite heart-stopping, actually.
That was scary, seeing him loaded into the hold at Heathrow, and we weren't really sure if he'd survive the journey.
The journey from London to Nairobi in 1970 was mammoth. It was 15 hours before Bill Travers, Ace and John arrived in Africa and were reunited with Christian.
It was just a huge relief to see him at the other end.
Christian had made it to Africa, but whether he could survive in the wild would be down to one man, George Adamson.
He was smaller than we imagined and quite dapper, in quite a crisp sort of safari suit.
This unassuming gentleman was a revered, if controversial figure in Kenya, where his practice of training domesticated lions to return to the wild was seen by some as risky to humans. George was taking Christian to Kora Nature Reserve in a deserted part of the country. There he hoped to establish a new lion pride with Christian at its heart.
We were driving up, Christian was in the back, and I knew he wanted to go to the loo. So I said, look, Mr. Adamson, please, we've got to stop. And George said, look, we're in the middle of nowhere. If he runs off, he said, we'll never catch him.
We very, very confidently said, no, he won't run off.
Christian got out, went to the loo, and I said, OK, come on, back you get. So he just jumped straight back into the Land Rover.
And in fact, George was very impressed.
George said, well, that's quite remarkable. I think he's going to be fine, and you can call me George. So I turned around to Christian and said, yes, yes, you're going to be all right.
After travelling over 200 kilometres, Ace, John and Christian arrived at Kora Nature Reserve, Christian's new home in the bush.
It must have been extraordinary for Christian to suddenly find himself in such a totally alien environment.
He might have been in a new continent, but Christian still demanded his home comforts.
The first night in Africa was a bit embarrassing, really. Ace had a bunk here and I had a stretcher here, a stretcher there, and Christian was there. Well, of course, he slept on one of the beds with a pillow.
With beds, pillows, Ace, John and photographer Derek there with him, Christian must have felt Africa was just like home. He seemed unfazed by his new environment.
Watching Christian's reaction to crocodiles and hippo popping their heads out of the water. He didn't want to be aggressive towards them. He just thought that they were part of the landscape.
The relaxed demeanour of Ace, John and Christian masked the reality. Christian was a London lion in Africa, and his background put him at great risk.
There are clear challenges in releasing a lion to the wild. It's not simply the matter of opening the back of a lorry door and letting it run free, because if you do that, it would be very likely to encounter other lions, behave inappropriately and risk death.
George Adamson's plan was to create a pride with Christian and 2 other lions, Catania, an orphaned lioness cub, and Boy, an adult male, born and domesticated in Africa. But first, they had to bond, a totally new experience for Christian.
He thought he was the only lion in the world, and it was a shock to meet one that was 3 times his size.
The first time he saw Boy, you can imagine, he hasn't seen a mature lion since his father. And there's this enormous and very cross lion too.
For Boy, Christian was a threat. In prides, younger lions often attempt to usurp an older lion's position.
His first reaction when he saw Christian was very aggressive and frightening.
He would keep charging at the wire to really scare Christian, and he was scared, and we were scared too, I can tell you. Boy was probably about 400 pounds, comes hurtling at the wire fence, which was only chicken wire. It's quite something.
Christian was scared and got in behind our legs and sort of snarled unhappily. It was quite scary.
Christian could not hide behind John and Ace forever. If George's pride was going to work, Christian and Boy would need to face each other outside the compound to establish the hierarchy.
One day, George said, we just have to bite the bullet. We just have to do it. And George and Ace and John and Christian walked up this rock to where Boy was sitting. Boy rose, and he seemed to double in size, and his mane sort of swelled. He looked truly, truly frightening.
This was a moment of life or death. Would Boy accept Christian?
It's really terrifying to see this huge, fully grown lion coming down and just belting Christian.
In the quickness of the movements, we thought he could be killed.
But amazingly, Christian's lion instinct kicked in.
Christian snarled but rolled onto his back in the correct submission to an adult lion.
Christian stood it, he didn't run away, and he obviously knew that this was part of being a lion was.
Battling for position within the pride is normal lion behaviour. Christian wasn't injured by Boy's attack, but he had been put in his place.
Boy had established he was the boss, he was the father of the pride, as it were, and Christian knew his place, and they became absolutely closest of friends.
George Adamson was pleased his first Cora pride was finally taking shape. But now there was no longer a role for Ace and John.
We could see it was starting to work, and we had to step back, and the relationship that we had with Christian, we had to pass on to George. It was sad to leave him, but there was a moment of thinking, there you are, you're in the right place, the right man, and you've really got a chance.
The fact that we'd got him there and he would probably have a future there, it made our feelings not irrelevant, but that was such a good feeling.
Ace and John's life had centred on Christian for over a year. Now, after 4 weeks with him in Kenya, it was time to leave Christian with his new family, his lion pride.
He did pad down the track as we left, and that was sad.
Returning to London was difficult for John and Ace, but George Adamson sent them regular bulletins on Christian's progress.
I've still got all his letters that You know, he would bring us up, he'd type them away on his, you know, little old Remington, whatever it was. It was always, you know, the